Hello everyone, my name is Juan Salem, and today I'll be speaking to you about how you go about measuring the housing market. First of all, why is it important? As you guys probably all very well know, the housing market is probably one of the most significant components of the US economy. According to the Federal Reserve, it accounts for almost 16% of US GDP. On a personal level, housing is often one's biggest investment that you'll ever make. So obviously if the value of your house plummets, that's probably going to reduce your personal wealth by a significant amount. And really on the local level as well, municipalities, they depend on the value of the housing stock around them to levy property taxes. So really in a general sense, housing is just one of those markets that affects every single level of the economy all the way down to the individual person. The problem though is that housing is probably one of the most complicated goods to even measure because it's a composite good with unique characteristics that are constantly changing. So as you can see, sort of like if you were to predict the sales value of a house, really it'd be a factor of location, structural attributes, and the current macroeconomic conditions. And obviously the last two are, the last one's definitely going to be changing macroeconomic conditions. Structural attributes can definitely change in between owners, and you have deterioration of the quality of the house. And even location, even though it's fixed in a literal sense, a certain neighborhood could become more or less desirable over time. So those are extra layers of complexity. If that wasn't enough, getting data on housing is extremely complicated as well. The amount of data that's available is extremely limited because people tend not to reveal the attributes of their house unless it's going to go on sale. The public records have very, very few variables that are cataloged, and usually the way they catalog the variables is very inconsistent. So if you were to go about trying to establish a price level, there are sort of a couple sources that you could use. First is you could look at some county appraisal districts. The problem though is that they only appraise a house once when it's being built, and then they drive in front of the house once every 5 to 11 years, and they update their appraisal for that house. So that's a serious problem for cities like Austin, where most of the houses were built before the 1960s. You have the additional problem that when the appraiser comes up to the house, people tend to not go out and tell the appraiser about all the improvements they made to the house. So in that sense, like a lot of the information remains hidden. The other part that's kind of a little bit misleading is that the methodology that the appraisal districts use is that they define comparable sales very narrowly. So if there aren't any sales that were comparable to yours, what they do is they just roll over last year's value. So in effect, they create stability in their methodology. Sort of the other one that you could possibly look at is the median sales index. Basically what you do is you look at all the sales through a whole neighborhood and then just grab the median sales price. The problem with that though is that every single month the sales are changing, and so it's very hard to interpret what exactly the median sales price means, because the houses in one quarter that are being sold in one quarter are different than the houses in the other. Now, the sort of the most standard way that you measure housing, and considering like how complicated it is known as the Case-Shiller Housing Index. And essentially, what they do is in a sense, they circumvent the data collection problem, and they say, well, only look at houses that have constant quality over time. So you say like they look at repeat sales pairs, and then they find the percent appreciation between those sales. And what they do is what happens is that they throw out a lot of observations because they have to find houses that have no improvements, and really they're looking for houses that sell repeatedly over very short periods of time. So in theory this is what happens, but in practice they throw out almost 96% of all observations. And so in a sense it's a very, very small subset of housing sales that the Case-Shiller Index is looking at. And sort of what happens because they throw out so many is that it's such a thin sort of market that you're looking at, and it prevents that methodology from being applied to many cities. For example, Austin. Austin does not have a Case-Shiller Index because the housing stock is too small, and the repeat sales that there are not representative of the rest of the housing stock. And you also have the problem as well that when you need this index the most, sort of like when the economy is plummeting, you have very, very few sales, and when you have very few sales, you have even fewer repeat sales. So in this sense, like the methodology becomes very weak when you have sort of like a distressed market. So what I sort of set out to do is how could you construct a housing index that sort of uses as many sales as possible that you control for the attributes of the house, the quality of the house, and you could create a methodology that's robust against swings in the economy. And so the way that I propose that you approach this is that you construct a hedonic sales index. And really what you do is you create an index for every single little neighborhood inside of a city, and then you scale up the price level in that neighborhood to the rest of the city, to represent what's going on in the rest of the city. And to get sort of around the data collection problem, which I was mentioning about earlier, is you use the local Board of Realtors MLS database. And so the reason why this is a very convenient information source is that it's a proprietary network that basically 88% of all home sales go through this network. And in order to go through the network, the sales brokers, they catalog every house according to 40 variables, and more often than not, they go inside the house, they have an appraiser look at the house. So in this sense, it's like a lot of information that's locked and hidden is revealed when it goes through this network. So for methodology, what I went about doing is I looked at a given neighborhood, or a group of neighborhoods that were very similar, and I grabbed the median attribute of those 40 attributes that the MLS database catalogs. And then what I did is I looked at all the sales that occurred in that neighborhood, and I ran this regression every single quarter, and I computed coefficients for every single one of those neighborhood groups. So after I got the coefficients, what I did is I used a linear combination, and I constructed sort of the value of the median house in step one over and over and over again every quarter to see how the value of that house changes over time. So to give you some examples of what is, and actually before I start, there are some of the variables were a little bit more significant than others. For example, the remodeled kitchen, because one big criticism of this approach is that you can have a house that's built many years ago, but the problem is that it's been remodeled. Well, usually when people remodel a house, the kitchen is the first area that you actually do your remodel. So the remodeled kitchen is actually serving as a proxy variable in this case for whether the house has been updated. So here's sort of one example that I did for this using this methodology. I looked at Zone 4, which the Board of Realtors in the City of Austin has designated as sort of geographically and economically homogeneous. And this is sort of the median house for that neighborhood. And so really what I did is I created the hedonic index for the median house, and this is what you see. So just to kind of explain what's going on, so here you have sort of like the median house. It starts out very low. You see a peak in about 2008, and it sort of corresponds with what you would intuitively think would happen in this time of the economy. You have the recession going on in 2009, and this little anomaly right here, it's a little bit hard to figure out exactly what was going on right then, but one theory about why the price level would jump is that the first-time homebuyers credit expired during the first quarter of 2010. So there was a lot of stimulative activities going on in the housing market, which could possibly explain this little jump in the price level. But as you can see, it was a very temporary stimulus at first that went all the way back down.
So there was a zero right before it.
Excuse me. Yeah, so, and just while I was gathering the data, I just looked at the original list prices of the houses as well, just to sort of see like what's the disconnect between sort of what people are listing their houses at and what the houses are actually selling. As you can see, there's a very big disconnect between what people wish they could get for their house and what the house is actually selling for. And also while I was there, I grabbed sort of the final list price, right? So this blue line is categorizing the list price just before the house actually sold. So you can see sort of how far the list price had to fall before you actually got an offer on the house. Now I used the same methodology for my second example for East Austin. And you see the median house, it's a little bit smaller, definitely a smaller sales price value. And you have the same general trend where you have a peak in about 2008, then you see the recession, and then here you actually see this market actually recovering much better than North Austin. But as you can see, it's definitely trending downwards, which may not be a good sign. And here you can see the same kind of effect, very high list prices. But what you see with East Austin is though that the final list prices were actually very, very close, if not identical to the actual prices people were getting for their houses. So it's kind of different how economically